Great to be here to talk about putting the S back into the SDGs. Sorry, give me 1 second. There you go. All right. So those are the SDGs. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about these SDGs. I'm sure a lot of other speakers have, and a lot of other speakers will. But there they are. You know what they are. But when you look at those SDGs, there are 4 pieces that underpin this. 1, you need to have the economic growth. Secondly, you need to do this in an environmentally sustainable way. Third, you need to focus on the social dimension of it. And fourth, keep the governance going. There's 2 ways of thinking about this. 1, you need all of these 4 elements to drive the SDGs. But the flip side is that if you meet the SDGs, you'll meet other objectives in these areas. But my first key message of today is that the science is screaming at us now about sustainability. If we look right now at what we've seen, particularly on climate change, just read the news. Floods, fires, droughts, faster decay of the Arctic sea ice. We can see it every day in what we do. Second, scientific research and papers that have been put out in the last 12 months, including the IPCC report. That IPCC report basically said bad things happen at 1.5 degrees. It's much worse at 2 degrees. We can fix it, but we have to make changes now. And so you can see up on the slides some of these things that we're seeing about the impacts. Sea level rising by 1 meter at 2 degrees. Crop yields declining by 8 to 12%. Increased floods. But what's more important is if these happen, they translate into 100 million more people without water, 100 million more people living in poverty, 133 million migrants. This is the impact that climate change can have in the world in which we live. But it's not just climate change. There's been a recent report that shows our oceans are acidifying, and this is impacting fishing. We're losing topsoil 10 to 40 times as fast as it's being replenished. And as many of you, I'm sure, know, this is critical to agricultural production. Poor water quality killed 1.4 million people in 2018. You've still got 2.6 billion people without access to clean water in 2018. All of these things are translating into impacts on people's lives. And so the bottom line is that unless we can address climate change, we're not going to have a hope of meeting the SDGs. Basically, we're behaving as if we have a second planet. And as we don't, either we're going to have to change the way in which we meet these SDGs fundamentally. We don't have a planet B, so if we behave as we're behaving now, business as usual, we're effectively going to shoot ourselves in the foot. What help does it mean if we try and meet the SDGs, but in the purpose, don't worry about sustainability, reduce our economic growth, reduce our agricultural production? So the S in the SDGs is absolutely critical. Let me drill down on the challenge of mitigation in climate change. And you have here a graph that basically shows what the total projections are currently for global emissions. And you can see what happens if there's no climate policies. You can see where current policies take us, 3.5 degrees. Current NDC pledges, a little bit under 3, and what it takes to get down to 2 degrees. Let me borrow from something that Christiana Figueres does to just give you an order of magnitude of what this challenge is. Because we know if we don't get to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, very bad things happen. Assume this is the total global emissions at the moment, this piece of paper, 50 gigatons. Basically, to reach 2 degrees, we're going to have to cap at this level in the next couple of years. In 10 years' time, we're going to have to halve global emissions. 10 years after that, we have to halve them again. And 10 years after that, we have to halve them again, and then take this 6 or 8 gigatons of carbon emissions and sequester them in forests. That is the magnitude of the challenge that we face to avoid the impacts that we have. As Al Gore has said, it's possible, but that transformation has the scale and the impact of the Industrial Revolution, but the speed of the digital revolution. But it's not just about mitigation. We're already seeing, even if we can get to 1.5 degrees, huge impacts on the planet. So we have to step up adaptation. Climate adaptation has been the poor stepsister of mitigation. It receives a fraction of the financing and the attention, even though climate adaptation, as you could have seen from that first slide, is what will drive the SDGs. We have to increase the focus on adaptation. It's not just the financing, it's how we think about adaptation. The Global Adaptation Commission recently presented a report that one said we urgently have to do more on adaptation, but we have to do it differently. 3 revolutions. We have to understand it differently, we have to plan it differently, we have to finance it differently. But they also went ahead and said, if we do adaptation right, it can provide huge additional benefits. You see some of these here. Early warning systems have an 8-to-1 benefit to cost ratio. More resilient infrastructure, 4-to-1, 5-to-1 payback in terms of doing it. It's about how we do it differently. There's a great example of how India right now is tackling rural roads that gives you a sense of what this means. In the past, people have said, we're going to build our roads as we were going to do them before, but we're worried about resilience. Let's build an extra culvert, put some more cement on, strengthen the bridge, build some barricades, and we're good. That strategy is very difficult to do and will probably increase the cost of your road network by 15 to 20%. What the government here is doing in India is rethinking that and baking in resilience from the beginning, when those roads are planned, changing the location of rural roads, figuring out what are the critical parts that need investment, what pieces don't need investment. This way of thinking upfront at the beginning about adaptation and sustainability before you make the investment is much cheaper than trying to do it on the fly afterwards. And this is an example that the Global Adaptation Commission has picked up as good practice. But everybody focuses on the cost and the downside. Oh, woe is me, climate change, terrible. If we get it wrong, yes. But the upside of getting it right is huge. If you look at the new climate economy report that recently came out, they've calculated that by 2030, the incremental economic benefit of a low-carbon, climate-resilient pathway is $26 trillion globally. And that pathway, compared to business as usual, will create 65 million more jobs. So it's not a question of trading off climate, low-carbon, resilient development and growth. Sustainable, low-carbon, resilient growth is the growth story of the future. It's not an alternative. One of the reasons why climate action is so important is there are often co-benefits. Air pollution. Let's talk about air pollution as one of the SDGs and one of the topics. I don't need to tell you what this is all about. As I was preparing this presentation, I had a look at the app, and it said the air quality index was 775. That was yesterday morning. That sounds abstract. That's smoking 35 to 40 cigarettes a day if you're walking outside in the weather. I don't need to tell you this. You all know it. But let's think about what does it take to fix this air pollution issue. Policy issues for two-wheelers, emissions from power plants, traffic regulations, but also pollution from stubble burning. How do we deal with stubble burning? Part of it is technology, but the key eventually it's going to have to be tied to some diversification of crops in Punjab. That can only happen if those farmers have policies in place to allow them to diversity, if they have cold chains, if we can manage water differently. What I'm saying is that to address the air pollution issue, you need a multi-sectoral airshed response and the institutions in order to deliver it. It's not a technical fix to do this, and it's not a silver bullet that's going to get us there. A second example that illustrates my point of the triple wins and the kind of things we need to deliver on the SDGs is cooling. Now you might be saying, what's the World Bank, an organization whose mission is to eliminate poverty, talking about a luxury item like air conditioning? Point is, air conditioning and cooling is not a luxury item. We know in India, for every degree centigrade above average temperature, we lose 3% productivity. By 2050, that lack of cooling could lead to a 6 or 7% reduction in GDP. So putting cooling in is not a luxury item, it's a core issue of productivity. But we also know we only have 6% air conditioning coverage here in India. If that grows to 30%, the total amount of air conditioning power that you will need could be 150 gigawatts of power, which is a huge share of the network. But if we can do low greenhouse gas emitting, high energy efficiency air conditions, we can make huge benefits. Globally, going to best-in-class, innovated, high energy efficiency, low greenhouse gas emitting air conditioners, compared to business as usual, will save 1 degree centigrade, just the air conditioning. But again, how do we do this? Part of it is technology. There was a great cooling price discussion yesterday, but technology alone won't do it. It requires bulk procurement, it requires labeling, it requires institutions, it requires policies in order to get there. So when I listen to all of this, let me use a sort of a trick or formatting to say, what are the generalized implications of what I've been talking about? What are the top 10 implications of what I've been talking about for the SDGs? First one, sustainable is the growth path of the future. There is not a growth path of the future that's viable that doesn't build in sustainability elements of the SDG. If we try, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. Secondly, business as usual won't get us there. We need to think longer term and differently. Think of this. The world population is 7 odd billion. It's going to grow to 9 billion. You've got to feed those 9 billion people. But we also know agricultural production is going to decline by 15% because of climate change. You also know that countries are getting richer. They're going to want to switch to products that, if you don't manage them quickly, have a higher carbon emitting. They're going to want refrigerated products. They're going to want supermarkets. That is radically going to change the agricultural system. More business as usual, a little bit of extension here, is not going to change it. Take urbanization. Big issue here in India. Globally, 2 billion people moving into cities. By the middle of the century, you're probably going to have 5 cities of over 50 million people. This, again, it's not an incremental change. Can you do a little bit better in the city? It's a fundamentally different way of looking at things. Take transport. We can talk about the emissions, but if we grow the number of individual cars in relation to GDP as we've done technology, forget the climate, it's a parking lot out there. So what I'm saying is, as we think forward to the longer term, we fundamentally got to have a different business model in terms of we look at it. This transformation, as I said earlier, is going to be a scale and urgency we haven't seen before. And we can't do it as an add-on. As I said earlier in some of my examples, we have to mainstream it now. The old strategy that China used of pollute now, clean up later, doesn't pay. The Americans learned when you could light the Cuyahoga River on fire, and then they had to clean it up. That is not a smart strategy going forward. We have to do it now, and we can do it. These solutions have to be multi-sectoral. We've got to learn to play together nicely. I know even within the World Bank, to get our transport people to talk to our urban people, to talk to our water people, is a challenge. Maybe you have some of these issues here in India. You'll have to see. We've got to learn to play nicely together. Number 6, innovation and technology are our friends. If you think about the examples that I've given, to make this transformation happen, the key is innovation and technology. That fall in the solar PV prices, the innovations that have taken place in electric vehicles, that are going to take place in batteries. We have to encourage that innovation. Without the innovation and the technology, we're not going to get there. But it's not just technology, it's also business models. What ESL did here, in terms of rolling out the LED light bulbs, is a key example of that innovation. If this point was not here, we might as well give up and go home, given everything that I've said before. But that means that we've got to have the public and the private sector to work together. This is not just private sector does this, public sector does this, who does what? How do we make this come together? It's all about policies, institutions, and political economy. Yeah, we can have technical solutions. Yes, it's important to lay pipes in order to give people water, but we've got to build the institutions that will lay the pipes in the future in a sustainable way and ensure the access to water. The minister touched on this from what I could understand from my non-existent Hindi. The SDGs are critical for India, but India is critical for global SDGs. This has two pieces. Number one, just sheer numbers. If you want to add up the numbers at the end, India is a big part of those numbers. But India has a leadership opportunity. There's lots of examples that I've illustrated and we can talk about. India can lead the way. It's also important, because of the size of the Indian market, you have the opportunity for businesses. India could be the country that has the home to the high energy efficiency air conditioner, the electric vehicle. Why can't India do for those industries what China did for solar PV? Not to mention Swachh Bharat to Nigeria, some of the things the minister touched on. All of these critical issues. And finally, respect the science, knowledge, and lessons. We can share a lot of knowledge going forward. From the World Bank Group's perspective, I won't talk a lot about this. You can see our strategy for South Asia here, SDGs front and center. You can see what we're doing on sustainable development, delivering services, using natural resources. SDGs are fundamental to what we're doing. On climate, after the Paris Agreement, we put an action plan together. We doubled our financing for climate in 2 years. And by 2021 to 2025, we've committed $200 billion, which is, again, another doubling for climate. This is fundamental, not because we think it's a politically correct thing to do, but it's fundamentally important for development. Now you're saying, what's going on here? Okay, we've suddenly got a runner on the screen. What's going on? Okay, I was a competitive runner, and some of you might know that 3 or 4 weeks ago, Eliud Kipchoge, a Kenyan, for the first time ran a sub-2-hour marathon. Why is this important? When I was running competitively, everybody said, this is impossible. You can't do it. But they did it. How did they do it? Leadership, teamwork, management, a target, everybody working together on it. But what does this do? This kind of achievement sells courage. Now people look at this and say, we can do it somewhere else. Same thing is happening here in India. ESL did the light bulbs. That gives people courage to do something else. We got energy pricing from renewable energy in Madhya Pradesh down to parity with coal. That kind of thing gives some leadership. What I'd like to do is to close with a quote from my former president, Nelson Mandela. It always seems impossible until it's done. That's how I feel about the SDGs. What I've lined up is a huge challenge. It seems impossible till it's done, but it can be done if we all work together. Thank you.